The Labour Party look like they might want to potentially, we don't know, or there's talk they could delay the minimum wage for young people being raised. What's your reaction to that?
I think it'd be an outrageous thing to do. We have huge intergenerational injustice. In fact, the young people I speak to regularly are worried that they're still living with their parents at home, they're stuck. A lot of them feel like they can't even rent their own place, never mind get on the housing ladder. Now, we know that small businesses also need protecting, but we could do that by reducing things like business rates, by lowering energy bills. So we shouldn't be pitting small businesses or people who are employing young people against the young people themselves. We should be looking at young people as an investment and actually making sure they're paid properly with a proper living wage, which is what they were promised by this Labour government. Then actually what we're doing is investing in the future of our economy.
So how are you going to pay for that?
Well, I think we could look at redistributing money. So at the moment, we are the 6th largest economy in the world. The 50 wealthiest families in this country own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population. That's 50 families
wealth tax.
versus 34 million people. Exactly, a suite of wealth taxes looking at how to redistribute
And
money.
how much do you think you'd make from that?
Well, so a wealth tax on assets, for instance, you could be looking between 12 to 15 billion pounds. But also we need to bring things like capital gains tax in line with income tax.
But, you know, there are plenty of experts that say that actually the number of people that would leave this country, it's very hard to predict how much you'd actually make. And countries like France have not made as much as they thought from a wealth tax. You know, you're going to need to borrow more, aren't you?
Well, I'd refute the idea that people would leave the country, but even let's pretend that's true. Investing in young people ultimately has a multiplier effect. Every pound that you put into a young person, whether that's in education, skills or confidence, is ultimately benefiting your economy later on down the line. What the Labour government are doing is the complete opposite of that. Austerity is a false economy. If you don't invest in young people, if you burden them with student debt, for instance, rather than public investment, that's why we get the kind of problems we've got, not to mention the mental health crisis that's absolutely rife throughout young people because they're really worried about their futures.
Is your priority young people then? Those are the people you're targeting?
My priority genuinely is the 99% versus the 1%. And when I say 1%, that's multimillionaires and billionaires and the big corporations. If you're a young person, an older person, a small business or a medium business, or even someone out of work, I want to make sure those people know the Green Party's out there representing them.
But, you know, if you want to do everything you're talking about, abolishing tuition fees, paying younger people more, you are going to need to borrow more, right?
I think it's possible that we would need to borrow more, but ultimately, you know, last week I met with Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel-winning economist, and he talked about the fact that when you borrow, there's a big difference between borrowing for investment and borrowing for consumption. Now, what Liz Truss was doing was borrowing to fund unfunded tax cuts, which is essentially consumption. What we need to be doing is borrowing to make sure we're investing in the future infrastructure of this country, in jobs, in skills, and indeed in young people.
But you've suggested before that you don't think we should hold the markets in such esteem that we currently do.
No, I don't. I think far too often the markets dictate too much of our policy. The markets are important, but ultimately the bond markets aren't ideological. They just want to see a clear plan. And young people have to be part of that clear plan. So how much better...
Isn't that the lesson that Liz Truss learned?
Well, I thought she was completely chaotic. There was no plan there whatsoever, and in fact, that's why we saw partly the bond markets react so badly. We know that that was a rushed budget that didn't have any coherency. What I'm talking about is the complete opposite of that. It's recognising how important young people, their education, their skills and their confidence is to the future of this country. They literally are the future of this country. Invest in them to improve the economy and make sure that they have better outcomes. That's not just good for young people, that's also important for pensioners. We need to pay their pensions after all, and we're going to need working-age young people to do that.
Do you think there's any limit to how much the government should be able to borrow?
Yeah, I think there's lots of limits to that. I think ultimately we need to be sensible about what we're borrowing and how we run our economy. But I think also you could reverse that question and say, how ridiculous is it, the amount that we're cutting at the exact moment that we don't have productivity? That's the worst thing to do. You're just going to make things worse, and that's what we're seeing with this government and why they're spiralling, why wages are stuck in 2008 and food prices are out of control.
It was interesting, we were talking to Reform earlier, obviously the complete polar opposite of you politically, but they seem to have softened their economics now that they are doing so well in the polls that they could actually potentially be in government. You know, is the beauty of being an opposition party that isn't going to be in government that you can say what you like and you don't necessarily have to make the sums add up?
Well, I think it'd be really irresponsible to do that, and that's exactly why the Green Party have always put forward a costed manifesto at any general election. It's also why I always want to answer questions honestly about the wealth taxes. and why I think we should have a conversation about the fact that the real wealth creators in this country are cleaners, teachers, nurses, the people who keep our economy moving. That's not just me saying that. There's lots of evidence from that. Various economic organisations and think tanks have been making the argument for a long time that austerity is a really bad move, and ultimately what this country needs is investment.
Do you think any of the other parties are thinking seriously about the young generation?
Yeah, I think it would be unfair to say no one seriously thinks about the younger generation, but what I'm more concerned about is their actions. And we know from the Labour government, the fact they're even floating this idea will be deeply worrying to a younger generation that have experienced injustice after injustice. We know that things are getting harder and harder, and ultimately there's huge anxiety about their future. I think in the Conservatives, we've seen a party that have shown what they think of younger people through 14 years of Conservative austerity, and I don't think anyone trusts reform to look after the population other than the multimillionaires and billionaires that they seek to serve.
Would you, I know you've been asked this before, but I'm going to ask it again, would you go into coalition with Labour?
Not under Keir Starmer. This is a man who has eventually...
Under another leader?
Well, it'd be silly to rule that out.
There could be a new leader after May.
Yeah, I think ultimately we need to see who that new leader is and what the policy platform they put forward is.
Anyone in the current cabinet?
I always pride myself on answering a question directly, but also it'd be really silly for me to just endlessly speculate. And also I've been criticised, I think quite rightly, if people misunderstood what I said, for saying I'm going to dictate who the Labour leader is or who the Prime Minister is. In many ways, that's none of my business. That's up to the Labour membership. What I think is clear, though, is that I don't think Keir Starmer will be there much longer.
And lastly, do you think there's been too much focus on older people because they're more likely to vote generally in politics?
I don't know about too much focus, because I'm also concerned about older people. I think sometimes they have a pretty bad deal of it. We know loneliness among the older population is a huge issue. And just this week, I met with Carers UK, and they spoke a lot about the pressures facing not just older people, but more widely. But obviously, if you're older and you might be caring for another older relative, there's lots of difficulties. I think it's also true, though, that governments have often pitted the older generation against the younger generation. I don't think that's helpful. I think actually the divide is between the majority of the population and the super powerful and the super wealthy. And I think ultimately we need to make sure that we're taxing wealth and power.
OK, Zack Polanski, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks so much for having me.